Hello and welcome to Security in Context. I'm Anita Fuentes, and today I am speaking with Van Jackson, Senior Lecturer in International Relations at Victoria University of Wellington, and co author, along with Michael Brennes, of the new book, The Rivalry Peril. In this interview, we'll be unpacking the book's central critique that U.S. efforts to compete with China militarily and economically are misguided and carry a steep cost for democracy, for peace, and for prosperity. Welcome, Van. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, to start, I wanted to ask you what motivated you and Michael to write this book now, and what are the central concerns that you were hoping to bring to public and policymaker attention?
Yeah. So in the Trump 1.0 years, we saw that the China threat was something that Trump himself was personally amplifying. Like he was heightening the sense of siege that we were facing from China. And it had a lot to do with his own personal stuff with he's obsessed with tariffs and trade deficits, and so he had a obsession with China in that way. But the national security state, who largely thought of themselves as like anti-Trump, even though they served Trump, they had been sort of looking for the next big threat. And Trump basically created a permissive environment where the they were able to like make China that ultimate boogeyman threat. And that had been building during the Obama years. Like it wasn't new to Trump, but Trump provided a new um, license to really focus and retool on China and kind of like get obsessed about China in the way that the US had once been obsessed about the Soviet Union. And so my co-author and I, Mike Brennes, were seeing that, and we were very disturbed by that. And like on one level, we recognized that they were not diagnosing China correctly. They were projecting onto China all their worst fears, all their worst ambitions. It really didn't matter what China was doing or what China was saying. So that itself was a problem. But the scarier thing was that as we transitioned from Trump 1.0 into the Biden years, the Biden guys, who are supposed to be more responsible and more sane and all of that, more civilized or something, they they started talking about like new Cold War, and they were comparing the China threat actively to like the Soviet threat and Soviet communism. And like suddenly, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, for decades we had just kind of downplayed the communist part of the CCP, and then suddenly all these US policymakers are like communist China, communist this, communist that, like just hysteria. And it was all kind of like manufactured. The larger American public did not feel this. Experts largely did not recognize this, but the national security state and the think tanks and the Congress, like the US political class, this little 1% section of elites had become like obsessed, and they were anchoring everything in the Cold War analogy. The Cold War analogy dominated Washington. And Mike, my co-author, is a historian of like Cold War liberalism, basically. And I study international relations, and I knew quite a bit about the geopolitics and the China side of it and U.S. foreign policy. And like together, we decided that like we need to write something about this, because the Cold War analogy, depending on what you mean by it, it's like a really bad fit for the situation that we face. And so it's based the way Washington thinks of the Cold War. It's this cherry-picked history that like remembers a heroic struggle against totalitarianism, and it produced this unqualified U.S. victory, and it invigorated U.S. social reforms. And that's just not right. Like that's not really correct. That's definitely laundering or sanitizing a very dark history, right? It's very romantic. And so if you're going to compare to the Cold War, the right analogy is that the Cold War was this global regime of violence and hierarchy and exclusion. And that's what superpower competition unleashed. And so the Cold War stunted democracy in the global south. The Cold War risked the annihilation of the entire planet multiple times. The Cold War saw the US launch more than 60 coups in the third world, and a bunch of them, but most of those were dictatorships against democracy. So it's like, that's what the Cold War is. And if you think the Cold War is some like, oh, gee, we're going to be heroes again, that kind of shit, we're all going to die. Like you're bringing us into World War III and you don't even know it because you have such romantic view of of what happened in the past. So what is happening now is a kind of Cold War if we understand the Cold War as a global regime of violence, hierarchy, and exclusion. And that sucks.
This is perfect because I wanted to ask you precisely about, how in the book you talk about how the Cold War is usually or often remembered as a long peace, but it actually reinforced all these racial and gender hierarchies, and it fueled right wing radicalism, right? So,
Hmm.
uh, how do these consequences shape the way that you think about today's great power rivalry?
Yeah, I mean, so this is our concern. Like the way that the national security state and the way that political elites talk about great power competition, it's it has no political valence. It's like stripped of the political implications. And to me and Mike, that's crazy. Like all foreign policy decisions happen in a political context. I mean, security in context, right? Like we know this as part of security in context. Like bad stuff happens when you decontextualize the decisions of power. You know what I mean? Like, because then you start to obscure who benefits, who's eating shit. Like the crucial questions of politics get erased when you erase the context. So,
This is gonna
um,
make such a good clip for social media. Thank you for that.
yeah, yeah, I hope that one works out. Um, I forgot what the question was now.
It was, it was about the consequences and how the
Mhm,
consequences, the Cold War and how they shape how you think
mhm.
about, great power rivalry.
Yeah, so we're trying to situate geopolitics in its domestic political context. And we mean that in the domestic political context, not only of the US, but of everywhere. So the geopolitical moves, the the national security state tends to think of them in these very sanitized ways where it's like, well, it's about power balancing, or it's about preventing hegemony or asserting our own hegemony. And some of that is true, but even to the extent that that's true, it completely misses like, what effect does this have on democracy itself? So the geopolitics question, they are building toward World War III. They claim that they're doing the opposite, and actually, this is how you prevent World War III. Like it's a perversity argument about you arms race. It's like if you want peace, prepare for war, right? That so they bring us closer to war, but then they lie to us and tell us the opposite. And that's the peace, war, geopolitics part. But what's always missing when people talk about geopolitics is like, what's happening in the actual politics that produces geopolitics. And what we know from the Cold War, but also earlier, just like great power history going back to the early 1800s, you see ruling classes making these decisions with state power, and they do so in a way that allows ruling classes to hoard more power, concentrate power for themselves. It's at the expense of civil society, it's at the expense of democracy. And so there's this hard, like guns butter trade off constantly. And geopolitics is a way of doing that trade-off in favor of guns instead of butter. And so we don't think of geopolitics as a language of inequality, but that is like factually what it is throughout history. But in the US and in the case of China, like the way we size up China, most of the problems are problems of inequality. And so the way we understand great power competition itself is that it is an inter-imperial rivalry, right? So as the dividends of neoliberal globalization shrunk, global growth stagnated, right? Especially after the global financial crisis in 2008. Well, neoliberal globalization was just not paying off anymore. Like, as growth started to kind of disappear, and it was like, where do countries go to like juice up their GDP? It wasn't so clear. And so China and the US in particular started turning to economic nationalism, mobilizing state power on behalf of the economy. And so if you have a powerful state, you can grab a greater share of a shrinking global economic pie, right? And you didn't have to do that in the era of neoliberal globalization because you could claim win-win. Yes, workers had to suffer for it, but the nation, quote unquote, was doing quite well. Most nations were doing quite well. It was just unequal distribution of gains. And that, as bad as it was, globalization has kind of gone away. And so what's replacing it is ethno-nationalism, economic nationalism, and that's fueling inter-imperial rivalry because it's like states are mobilizing and the great power states are mobilizing against each other. And then that's how you end up seeing this contest over like critical minerals and reshoring supply chains. And like that's what all of that is ultimately about. And so I think John Hobson 100 years ago had this like theory of imperialism, and it was about surpluses. Like inequality at home required foreign markets in order to sustain the inequality at home because the owners of production are making more than domestic demand can handle. So where does that surplus go? It has to go into overseas markets, right? So there's an element of that inequality too when it comes to China, and so you've got inequality as a cause of geopolitical rivalry, but also as an effect of it. Um, and so in the book we sort of try to like tease all that out and explain all of that because in the world of geopolitics it's just stuff that nobody talks about. But like, if you're a leftist or a socialist or something, like, you almost take for granted that this is true. But we need the receipts. So the book is the receipts.
I was gonna ask you about this, so and you answered already, so perfect. But yeah, I do think this is what happens when you don't send people questions in advance, so it's my fault. But yeah, it is one of the books, in my opinion, more urgent arguments, right? How that great power competition doesn't just affect foreign policy, but it also affects politics at home, right?
Mhm.
I also wanted to ask you. You've already kind of mentioned this, but in this analysis of the post Cold War unipolar moment that you and Michael do in the book, you suggest that US overreach played a big role in shaping China's rise
Mm.
and the rivalry today. So, how do you see the legacy of the war on terror and also the 2008 financial crisis, which you mentioned, playing into this dynamic?
Yeah, so the financial crisis is part of making a world of lower growth, and it's the lower growth that's the context where national security states start to like securitize the economy, and that's how states start mobilizing power on behalf of the economy. The other part that I didn't mention is that this is more in like international relations language, but the US like strategy toward the world, its grand strategy for a long time. I mean, like, people date its origins differently, but like at least since the 1980s, the US has had a grand strategy of primacy. And primacy is a kind of it's a strategy of like domination. Basically, like it requires an extreme imbalance of power, and it treats other great powers as priority threats. And that has been the approach to the world since the 80s. But for a big chunk of that last 40 years, there was no great power threat to prioritize. So the obsession is always with great powers in this way of seeing the world, but there hadn't been great powers to obsess about for a while. And then in the 21st century, there of course has been. And so primacy, because it requires an extreme imbalance of power, it is uniquely compatible with unipolarity, with the unipolar moment. So when the global distribution of power is not distributed at all, and it's concentrated in the hands of one state, um, that's unipolarity, right? Unipolarity is uniquely suited to this grand strategy of an extreme power imbalance because it is an extreme power imbalance. So that makes sense, even if you're like, well, that doesn't make it good, right? Agree. But that's at least possible. It's rational, right? Well, this is one of the problems and why we are facing great power competition. It's not just that it's an inter-imperial rivalry, it's also that the global distribution of power is no longer unipolar. It has become multipolar, and it's multipolarizing more over time. And so we are still pursuing a grand strategy that you could call primacy. It's like looks a little bit different from president to president, but the basic premises are all the same. The idea that it is necessary to power hoard and have an extreme imbalance of power remains the same. The obsession with great power threats remains the same. That is a strategy that's literally of and for the unipolar moment. We're not in that moment anymore. And if you try to do a primacy grand strategy in a multipolar world, it's like lighting a barrel of gunpowder on fire. Like that's Nazi Germany shit. Like you're doing expansionism and you're getting more aggressive and you're wielding economic nationalism and you're all jingoistic and patriotic because that's the ideology that goes along with extreme power, you know? And the rest of the world is like, well, we disagree and we have some power. And so like you don't have all the power anymore, Uncle Sam. So go fuck yourself. And that's kind of where we're at right now. And so we're by doing primacy in a world where the global distribution of power does not allow for it, we are asking for conflict in various forms.
Right. And you end the book by proposing a ambitious alternative to this rivalry, right? So I wanted to ask you what this alternative looks like in practice. And I also wanted to ask you, how would you respond to critics who see de-escalation with China as naive or even dangerous, given concerns about authoritarianism and expansionism?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things. So like I we assess China as problematic in certain ways. Like we try not to characterize it as like threat because that simply accepts how the national security state frames everything. But China is probably like China engages in human rights abuses. China's working class is suffering in big ways. Um, and Chinese foreign policy has become more jingoistic and more nationalistic, but we have to keep that in proportion. Like American foreign policy has become more jingoistic and more nationalistic. America's working class eats shit on the daily. I mean, like American workers are having a tough time. You know, the U.S. security state engages in human rights abuses on the regular and funds a genocide in Gaza. So, like, let's let's not be hypocrites here, right? And so, having that sense of proportion is very important. But that doesn't mean that it's like, well, if America's bad, then China must be good, right? That's like too simple. It's actually like, oh, they're all bad. Like all states are bad. No great power is good, and no great power will save us. So given that, what can we do, right? And this is the thing, like China's claims to Taiwan are not new, they're long-standing. And the on paper, the threat that China posed to Taiwan was the same since the late 90s, the early 2000s, the Obama years. And Taiwan was fine. Like Taiwan was engaging with China. They were integrating their economies more. The geopolitical environment was quite stable. Nobody thought about war with China over Taiwan, really, right? It's only when great power competition really starts, 2016, 2015, and then into the Trump years, only once great power competition is on do we have a situation where Taiwan feels imperiled, where Taiwan feels under siege. Taiwan is extremely insecure. The prospect of China invading, it's not a high probability, but it's a very real possibility. And we have to take that seriously as something that could happen. That just wasn't the case before great power competition. And there's a lesson in that, right? Because the balance of power, the balance of forces across the Taiwan Strait has not really changed. It was unfavorable toward Taiwan the whole time. The difference is that we existed in a relational context where the US strategic relationship with China was stable, basically cooperative, mostly friendly, and therefore China restrained its own claims against Taiwan. It didn't abandon the claims, it just didn't press up on it. Like it was not urgent. You know what I mean? And so it was not a priority. They didn't feel the need to be all jingoistic about it. Once you have great power competition, well, that's part of what great power competition is: chest thumping and flag waving and threat making and all of this stuff. Like more missiles, guys. Let's do more missiles. Like that's what great power competition has opened up, unleashed. So we need to reverse that. We need to get we were in a much better place, a much less catastrophic place. World War III was not at the front of our minds in the previous era, where China and the US had a kind of strategic détente. And we need to get back to that. And the question is how? So, what we propose is giving détente with China, a new détente, a foundation, a material foundation. And that material foundation has to do with this grand bargain that we envision, where China and the US together address the sovereign debt crisis in the global south and the green energy transition in the global south, because China holds a disproportionate amount. It's the largest bilateral lender of foreign assistance and development aid to the global south. And China also overproduces green technology, EVs and batteries and solar panels and stuff. They produce more of that shit than like the whole world can handle, you know? And so clearly they're overproducing relative to domestic demand in green tech. But you know who needs green tech? Everybody else. And so they have a surplus of the thing that the world needs in order to transition to a green economy. And so US could coordinate with China to relieve, forgive, restructure sovereign debt in the global south and to finance China's green tech exports to the global south. And then China can work with the US EV manufacturers, because China has almost a monopoly on certain parts that US manufacturers need to make EVs competitively. So US manufacturers actually cannot be competitive in the EV market unless they work with Chinese firms. And that's the opposite of what the US is doing right now. But that means that if we can cooperate in all of these ways, ultimately we're making the global south a portion of the world where national economies do not have to be strangled by debt, and they can adapt more quickly, more easily to a world of climate crisis. And what that does is it unleashes like the market power of the global south. So right now, the consumption ability of the global south is quite low, partly because their governments are largely imposing austerity on them. They can't spend on public welfare because they have to service their foreign debt, sovereign debt. And because they're having to spend money on, natural disasters in response to climate change and this kind of thing, right? Well, if we could help them with that, they would basically be activated as new markets. A new source of global growth would be a high powered, economic market of the global south. Global growth addresses that initial problem that led to inter-imperial rivalry in the first place. So the we fell off of neoliberal globalization. We went into economic nationalism and ethno-nationalism. Well, going back to globalization would not be great, or like maybe we could do it better. This is a way of doing it better. But under great power competition, it's totally impossible. Only in a context where the great powers have a cooperative habit could you do these kinds of arrangements. In the current environment, in a Cold War mood, you cannot do any of this shit, which is why we're not doing any of this shit. So we know what needs to be done. And in the meantime, you can like build confidence. Well, what if China invades Taiwan? You can build confidence in the meantime by like bridling our national security states, constraining our military power, rejecting the need for an imbalance of power. We have power. China doesn't threaten our existence. It just threatens our primacy, So let's not do primacy anymore. And that can build the confidence and the habits of cooperation, a cooperation spiral instead of a conflict spiral. And then that can get us into a relational context where it's possible to address the collective problems of humanity. We're supposed to be great powers. We should be acting like great powers on behalf of humanity. So that's the spiel. That's the talk.
Well, will it happen is the real question. But
No, probably not.
on a more positive note, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap
uh no, just buy the book. Yeah.
That's the great thing to add. Well, in that case, Van, thank you so much for your insights. And to our audience, thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed this discussion, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn.